Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Ibis stared at the message on his phone, his hands cold with a mix of anger and disbelief. It was from Ebby. I know I messed up, bro, but please just talk to me. I need you. Ibis exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He could still hear his mother's voice from the night before, how she cried when the rumors started, how his father shook his head in disappointment. All because of Ebba's lies. He wanted to believe in second chances, but how do you forgive someone who burned every bridge with a smile on their face? Ezekiel's words rang in his head. A green snake in green grass, Ibis. That's what he's always been. Ibis turned off his phone and placed it face down on the table. Some friendships weren't meant to last forever. The four of them had always been together, from the narrow hallways of their high school to the dusty football field where they spent countless afternoons arguing about who was the best player in the world. Their friendship had been unshakable. Ibis was the kind of person people gravitated toward without effort. His laugh was infectious, his words always smooth, and no matter where they went, he made friends easily. Manny, on the other hand, was quieter, thoughtful, always the one to make sure no one in the group felt left out. Ezekiel was sharp, brutally honest, and fiercely protective, the type of friend who never let anyone take advantage of the people he cared about. And then there was Ebby. He had always been a little different, a little restless, a little envious, but back then it had only been small things. A glance when someone praised Ibis too much, a joke that cut a little too deep. No one thought much of it then. It was just how Ebby was. When the time came for university admissions, things shifted in a way none of them had expected. Ibis and Ezekiel passed on their first try, securing spots in a prestigious institution, while Mania and Ebby weren't as lucky. The moment they received their rejection letters, Mania accepted his fate with his usual calm, already making plans to try again the next year. But Ebby was furious. He laughed it off in front of the others, pretending it didn't matter, but in the quiet moments, when it was just him, the bitterness festered. He watched as Ibis and Ezekiel packed up their things, as they promised to visit and keep in touch, as they moved forward, while he remained stuck in place. And the worst part? They never gloated. They never made him feel small. That should have made it easier, but it didn't. It only made him hate the situation more. By the time the following year came, Ebby had convinced himself that things would be different. And in a way, they were. Ibis and Ezekiel, now well connected in their university, managed to pull some strings, securing admission for both him and Manny. The news came as a shock, an act of loyalty and kindness that should have brought nothing but gratitude. Mania was overjoyed, thanking them endlessly, swearing that he would never forget what they had done. But for Ebby, it was complicated. He smiled, he clapped Ibis on the back. He acted just as happy as Mani, but deep inside, something burned. It felt like yet another reminder of how much power Ibis had, how easily he could open doors that Ebby couldn't. And no matter how hard he tried to shake it off, he couldn't ignore the quiet voice in his head, whispering that he would never be like Ibis, no matter what he did. Ebby stepped onto the university campus with a slow, measured breath, scanning the tall buildings and the busy walkways packed with students moving in different directions. It should have felt like a victory, a long, overdue moment that signified he was finally part of something bigger. Instead, all he could think about was how Ibis and Ezekiel had already made this place their own. They knew the shortcuts, the hidden spots where students gathered to talk about things that mattered, the faces that held influence. Ebby and Mani were the newcomers. But somehow, Mani wore the title with pride, his gratitude as loud as his wide smile. Ebby, on the other hand, felt the weight of being second to something he should have earned on his own. From the moment they reunited, the difference was clear. Ibis and Ezekiel were closer than ever, their inside jokes rolling off their tongues effortlessly, their dorm room already a place where people stopped by to talk, to laugh, to be part of whatever energy they carried. Mania fit in easily, his humility making it impossible for anyone to see him as an outsider. But Abby noticed things. The way people lingered around Ibis longer, the way girls leaned in when he spoke, how even Ezekiel, who barely made an effort with most people, never hesitated to defend him, to build him up in conversations. It wasn't fair. Ebby tried to insert himself, to laugh a little louder, to mirror the things that made Ibis so effortlessly liked, but it never felt natural. No matter how many times he spoke to the same people Ibis did, the connection was never the same. It was as if something invisible separated them, as if everyone could tell that he was simply trying too hard. Ezekiel, sharp as always, was the first to notice. He watched Abby with careful eyes, his instincts already sensing something was off. He didn't like Abby, not really. There had always been something unsettling about him, something that felt just a little too slippery, too performative. But he tolerated him because of Ibis and Manny, because breaking the group apart over something that hadn't fully revealed itself felt unnecessary. Still, he wasn't blind. He saw the way Abby's smile faltered whenever Ibis was praised, how his laughter always came half a second late, as if he was waiting to see if anyone would look his way. It was small, but it was there. And though Ibis and Mania dismissed it whenever he brought it up, Ezekiel knew better. Some people didn't need to say their intentions out loud. Sometimes you just had to watch and wait. The first time Ibis truly felt it, the shift, the unspoken tension, was during a casual afternoon at the student lounge. It was a warm day, the kind that made everything feel slow and unbothered. He, Ezekiel, Manny, and Debbie were sitting around a table, laughing over something ridiculous Ezekiel had said when a girl approached. She had been talking to Ibis for a while. Nothing serious, just friendly banter and occasional walks back from lectures. She smiled as she greeted him, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder. Before Ibis could respond, Abby leaned forward, cutting in before anyone else had a chance to speak. "Naomi, you never say hi to me like that," he said, his voice teasing, but with an edge that Ibis couldn't quite place. Naomi gave him a small, polite laugh, but turned back to Ibis, clearly unfazed. The conversation continued, but Ibis noticed how Abby kept inserting himself, steering the conversation toward himself, trying to pull the attention his way. It was subtle, but once Ibis saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Over the next few weeks, it happened more often. Abby talking to the same girls he did, hanging around the same people, mirroring his words and gestures as if hoping to crack some invisible code that made Ibis so effortlessly likable. Ezekiel, of course, had seen it long before Ibis did. One evening, as they walked back to their dorm, he finally said what had been weighing on his mind. "Ibis, open your eyes, man. Ebby's not just hanging around. He's trying to be you." Ibis brushed it off at first, laughing because it sounded ridiculous. But later that night, when he thought about all the little moments, all the times Abby had pushed his way into conversations that weren't his, all the side glances filled with something unreadable, he felt an uneasy knot form in his chest. Mania, ever the peacemaker, told them there was no need for conflict. "Abby's just trying to belong," he had said. Maybe he doesn't know how else to do it, but deep down, Ibis wasn't sure. Because if that were true, then why did it feel less like friendship and more like a silent competition he never agreed to be part of? The message came late at night, just as Ibis was about to sleep. At first, he ignored it, thinking it was one of those random, long-time, no-talk texts people sent when they were bored. But when he finally checked his phone, the name on the screen made him sit up. Sarah. He hadn't spoken to her in 2 years, not since their relationship quietly fell apart under the weight of distance and time. She had moved on, and so had he, or at least he thought so. But now, here she was, asking to meet. "It's important," she wrote. "It's about Abby." Curiosity gnawed at him, so the next day he met her outside a small cafe near campus. She was the same, calm, observant, the kind of girl who only spoke when she had something meaningful to say. But today she looked troubled. She wasted no time. "I ran into one of my old friends the other day," she started. "We got to talking, and your name came up. And that's when I found out what Ebby was saying about you back then." Ibis frowned, confused. "Saying what?" Sarah exhaled, as if preparing herself. "He told me you were playing me," she said, "that you had other girls on the side, that I was just another name on your list, and at the time, I believed him." Ibis felt his stomach drop. "Ebby said that?" She nodded. "I was young, Ibis. I didn't even question it. But later, when I started seeing things for myself, I realized none of it made sense. You were never that kind of person." She sighed. "I should have asked you back then, but I didn't. And I just thought you should know." Ibis sat back, silent. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was still stuck in that space between disbelief and realization. Ebby had been poisoning his relationships from the beginning. Not just with Sarah, but who knew how many others. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some careless joke. It was intentional. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a bitter truth settled over him. Ezekiel had been right. Ebby wasn't just trying to be like him. He was trying to pull him down. And the worst part? He had been smiling in Ibis's face the entire time. The weight of it sat heavily on Ibis's shoulders in the days that followed. He didn't confront Ebby, not yet. Instead, he let things play out, watching with sharper eyes, no longer willing to ignore what had been there all along. He noticed how Ebby's laughter came only when he was at the center of attention, how he lingered in conversations just long enough to insert himself before steering things his way. Ibis saw the calculated movements, the way Ebby always seemed to position himself near the people Ibis was close to, never outright challenging him, but always testing how far he could stretch the boundaries of their friendship before anyone caught on. It wasn't just envy, it was something deeper, something unsettling. And yet Ebby carried himself as if nothing had changed, as if the foundation of their years-long friendship wasn't crumbling beneath his feet. Then came the rumors. At first, they were nothing more than whispers, small passing comments that Ebby barely paid attention to. But then the whispers grew louder. People started looking at him differently, some with skepticism, others with amusement, as if they knew something he didn't. Ezekiel, always the first to notice, was the one who brought it to his attention. "There's talk going around," he said one evening, leaning against the wall of their dorm with his arms crossed. "People are saying you're not who you seem to be." Ibis frowned, confusion tightening in his chest. "What does that even mean?" Ezekiel exhaled, clearly frustrated. "It means someone is telling stories about you. And I don't need to guess who." At first, Ibis wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, that maybe people were exaggerating things. But then he heard it for himself, his name, his reputation, twisted into lies he couldn't have imagined. According to the rumors, he was manipulative, a liar, someone who used people for his own gain. It was absurd. But even absurdity, when repeated enough, became believable. The final blow came when an old friend, someone he had always considered loyal, pulled him aside after class. "I just thought you should know," the friend said hesitantly, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "Ebby's been telling people you're the reason he got into trouble with his family. That you introduced him to things." The words hit like a punch to the gut. It was a complete fabrication, yet it was exactly the kind of story people would eat up. Ibis felt the blood drain from his face, his mind racing through all the times he had defended Ebby, all the moments he had brushed off the warning signs. And now, here he was, being painted as the villain in a story he hadn't even written. It was in that moment that Ibis knew this wasn't just jealousy. This was something personal. Ebby wasn't just trying to compete with him anymore. He was trying to destroy him. Ibis didn't say anything at first. He kept the knowledge buried inside him, letting it simmer beneath the surface as he watched Ebby more closely. And the more he observed, the more things started to make sense. The fake enthusiasm whenever Ibis achieved something, the way Ebby always inserted himself into conversations that weren't his, the small smirks whenever someone challenged Ibis in a group setting. It had all been there, hidden in plain sight. Ezekiel noticed the change in Ibis almost immediately. "What's going on?" he asked one evening as they sat in their dorm room. Ibis hesitated, then told him everything Sarah had said. Ezekiel didn't even look surprised. "I knew it," he muttered. "I've been telling you from the start, Ibis. That guy has never been your friend." Ania, as expected, tried to keep the peace. "Maybe there's an explanation," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe he was just insecure." "Insecure people don't go out of their way to ruin their friends' reputations," Ezekiel shot back. His voice was tight with restrained anger. "Face it, Mania. Eb has been a snake since day one. And now we have proof." For the first time, Ibis couldn't defend Ebby. He had spent years making excuses, convincing himself that Ebby's actions weren't as bad as they seemed. But now there was no denying it. The betrayal was real. It was deliberate. And for the first time since their friendship began, Ibis realized that Ebby had never truly been part of their circle. He had only been waiting for the right moment to tear it apart. The weight of it sat heavily on Ibis's shoulders in the days that followed. He didn't confront Ebby, not yet. Instead, he let things play out, watching with sharper eyes, no longer willing to ignore what had been there all along. He noticed how Ebby's laughter came only when he was at the center of attention, how he lingered in conversations just long enough to insert himself before steering things his way. Ibis saw the calculated movements, the way Ebby always seemed to position himself near the people Ibis was close to, never outright challenging him, but always testing how far he could stretch the boundaries of their friendship before anyone caught on. It wasn't just envy, it was something deeper, something unsettling. And yet Ebby carried himself as if nothing had changed, as if the foundation of their years-long friendship wasn't crumbling beneath his feet. Then came the rumors. At first, they were nothing more than whispers, small passing comments that Ibis barely paid attention to. But then the whispers grew louder. People started looking at him differently, some with skepticism, others with amusement, as if they knew something he didn't. Ezekiel, always the first to notice, was the one who brought it to his attention. "There's talk going around," he said one evening, leaning against the wall of their dorm with his arms crossed. "People are saying you're not who you seem to be." Ibis frowned, confusion tightening in his chest. "What does that even mean?" Ezekiel exhaled, clearly frustrated. "It means someone is telling stories about you. And I don't need to guess who." At first, Ibis wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, that maybe people were exaggerating things. But then he heard it for himself. His name, his reputation, twisted into lies he couldn't have imagined. According to the rumors, he was manipulative, a liar, someone who used people for his own gain. It was absurd. But even absurdity, when repeated enough, became believable. The final blow came when an old friend, someone he had always considered loyal, pulled him aside after class. "I just thought you should know," the friend said hesitantly, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "Ebby's been telling people you're the reason he got into trouble with his family, that you introduced him to things." The words hit like a punch to the gut. It was a complete fabrication, yet it was exactly the kind of story people would eat up. Ibis felt the blood drain from his face, his mind racing through all the times he had defended Ebby, all the moments he had brushed off the warning signs. And now, here he was, being painted as the villain in a story he hadn't even written. It was in that moment that Ibis knew this wasn't just jealousy. This was something personal. Ebby wasn't just trying to compete with him anymore. He was trying to destroy him. Ebus had always believed that truth had a way of revealing itself, that no matter how deeply buried, it would eventually claw its way to the surface. But now, as he walked through campus with the weight of Ebby's betrayal pressing against his chest, he realized that lies spread faster than truth. The damage had already begun. People he had known for months, some even longer, looked at him with quiet hesitation, their conversations with him shorter than before, their laughter less natural. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle but undeniable distance forming between him and the world he once moved through effortlessly. The worst part was that Abi didn't change a thing. He still acted as if nothing was wrong, still carried himself with the same eager charm, the same carefully crafted friendliness that made it difficult for people to see past the surface. But Abus saw it now. He saw how Abi watched him when he thought no one was looking, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long, as if waiting to see how much damage had been done. Ezekiel, as expected, wasn't the type to stay quiet about it. "You need to do something," he said one evening, standing by the dorm window, his silhouette dark against the fading sunlight. "You can't just let him walk around like nothing's happening." Ebus leaned back against the desk, rubbing his forehead. "And then what?" he asked, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Start a fight?" "Make a scene." "That's exactly what he wants. If I lose control, it only proves his point." Ezekiel exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "So you're just going to let him keep dragging your name through the mud?" Manny, sitting on the edge of the bed, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should talk to him," he suggested, his voice uncertain. "Make him explain himself." Ezekiel scoffed. "You think he's going to admit anything? Ebby's not stupid. He knows exactly what he's doing." Ebus knew that too. A confrontation wouldn't change anything. Ebby had already sunk his claws into the narrative, carefully weaving himself into the role of the victim while making Ebus look like the aggressor. Anything he said now would only sound like excuses. The real confirmation of Ebby's intentions came later that week when Ebus overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. He had been walking past one of the shaded seating areas near the library, lost in thought, when he heard his own name slip from Ebby's mouth. Something about the tone made him stop. Stepping back, he positioned himself just out of sight, listening as Ebby spoke to a small group of students. "I was always there for him," Ebby was saying, his voice heavy with false sincerity. "But the moment I needed him, he turned his back on me. I trusted him, and look where it got me." A girl murmured something in response, and Ebby sighed dramatically. "I don't want to make it a big deal," he continued, "but people need to know who they're really dealing with." Ebus felt his stomach twist. It wasn't just a few passing lies. Ebby was rewriting history, casting himself as the betrayed friend, the one who had suffered while Ebus had thrived at his expense. And the worst part? People were believing him. Because Ebby was good at this, good at twisting words just enough to make himself seem credible, just enough to plant seeds of doubt in people's minds. And for the first time, Ebus realized that it didn't matter how much proof he had, how well he knew the truth. In the end, people believed what they wanted to believe. Ebus had always been the kind of person who avoided unnecessary conflict, but there were moments in life where silence felt like surrender, and this was becoming one of them. The weight of Ebby's deception had been pressing against him for weeks, poisoning his reputation, seeping into spaces where his name had once been met with respect. He had thought ignoring it would make it fade, that the truth would eventually find its way back to the surface, but lies had a way of embedding themselves in people's minds, shaping their perceptions before the truth even had a chance to defend itself. The turning point came when a junior student approached him after class, hesitant and unsure, as if trying to decide whether she was making a mistake. "Ebus," she started, shifting nervously. "Is it true, what they're saying?" He already knew the answer before she finished her sentence. "That you got Ebby into drugs?" The words felt like a slap, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed what he had feared. Ebby had successfully rewritten history, placing himself as the victim of a tragedy that never belonged to him. Ebus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm, even as something inside him threatened to snap. He could have let it slide, could have walked away like he always did, but this wasn't just about rumors anymore. This was about who he was, and he refused to let someone else define that for him. "Where did you hear that?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fire burning inside him. The girl hesitated before mumbling, "People talk." Abby mentioned it in passing. He didn't say it outright, but she trailed off, looking guilty, as if she already regretted bringing it up. Ibis exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. It didn't matter how the lie had been told, Abby had planted the idea, and now it was growing in people's minds, turning him into something he wasn't. And for the first time, he realized that walking away wasn't an option anymore. That night, he made a decision. He called Ezekiel and Manny to their usual spot near the back of the student center, the place they had always gathered when things needed to be said without the noise of the outside world. The moment they arrived, Ezekiel could tell something had changed. "You're done letting this go, aren't you?" he asked, arms crossed. Ibis nodded. "I want to hear it from him," he said. Face to face. No more whispers, no more hiding behind other people. Mania looked uneasy. "You think he'll admit it?" Ibis shook his head. "No, but I need to see him try to lie to my face." Ezekiel smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Good, because I've been waiting for this moment." Ibis wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking to fight. But he was done pretending that Abby's betrayal didn't matter. It was time to confront the snake hiding in the grass and see just how much venom he had left. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. Ibis, Ezekiel, and Mania sat in silence, waiting. The small off-campus cafe was dimly lit, the hum of conversations around them blending into a distant murmur. Abby was late, but that was expected. He thrived on theatrics, on making people wait, as if it gave him control over the situation. But Ibis wasn't interested in playing along anymore. He had spent too much time letting things slide, hoping that silence would be enough to expose the truth. Now, as he tapped his fingers against the edge of the table, he realized that silence had only given Abby more space to twist the narrative. When the door finally opened and Abby strolled in, wearing that same easy smile that had fooled so many, Ibis felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't the expression of a man who felt guilt. It was the look of someone who believed he had already won. Abby slid into the seat across from them, his movements relaxed, as if he had been invited for a casual chat. "Didn't expect to hear from you guys," he said, leaning back. His eyes flickered over each of them before landing on Ibis. "What's this about?" The question was almost laughable, but Ibis didn't take the bait. He had spent enough time fuming over Abby's lies, replaying every betrayal in his head, but now that they were face to face, his anger was controlled, precise. "You tell me," Ibis said calmly. "Seems like you've had a lot to say about me lately." Abby's expression didn't falter. If anything, he looked amused. "I talk to a lot of people." "You'll have to be more specific." Ezekiel scoffed. "Cut the act, Abby. We know what you've been saying. We know how you've been twisting things, making Ibis look like the villain while you play the victim." Manny, always the peacemaker, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't argue. Even he could see the truth now. Abby sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "You really think I go around lying about you?" He looked at Ibis with mock disappointment. "Come on, man. After everything, you seriously believe I'd do that?" Ibis didn't blink. "I don't believe it," he said, his voice even. "I know it." The words hung between them like a blade, sharp and undeniable. For the first time, a crack appeared in Abby's carefully composed mask. It was subtle, the slight tightening of his jaw, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, but it was there. He knew he had been caught. Still, he forced out a chuckle, shaking his head as if this was all some ridiculous misunderstanding. "People talk," he said, his voice smooth, but lacking its usual confidence. I can't control what they believe. Ibis leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Ebis. No, but you can control what you tell them. There was no room for denial anymore. No more backpedaling. No more hiding. Ebby had been exposed, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Ibis saw something new in his so-called friend's face. Fear. Not the fear of being hurt, but the fear of losing his power, the power to manipulate, to deceive, to control the story. And in that moment, Ibis knew. He wasn't just confronting Ebby. He was taking back everything that had been stolen from him. Ebby sat frozen for a moment, his usual composure slipping. The air between them was heavy with an unspoken finality, the kind that settled between people when there was nothing left to salvage. He opened his mouth as if to argue, to weave another lie, but something in Ibis's gaze stopped him. This wasn't like before. There was no room for manipulation, no space for half-truths to slither through. Ibis had seen too much, had endured too many betrayals to fall for it again. Ebby let out a breath, masking his unease with a forced smirk. "You know what?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Believe what you want. I never needed your approval anyway." The words were meant to sound dismissive, like he was the one walking away on his own terms, but they rang hollow. For the first time, it was clear to everyone Ebby had lost control. Ezekiel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's it? That's all you've got?" He leaned forward, his voice dripping with disgust. "You spent months spreading lies, dragging Ibis's name through the dirt, and now that you're caught, you're just going to shrug it off?" Manny, who had been silent through most of the conversation, sighed deeply. "I actually feel sorry for you," he admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "Not because of what's happening now, but because you never had to do any of this. We were your friends. We had your back, and you threw it all away because you couldn't stand not being the center of everything." The weight of Manny's words settled over the table like a thick fog. For a split second, something flickered in Ebby's expression, something dangerously close to regret, but just as quickly, it was gone. He scoffed, shaking his head. "You guys are acting like this is some big betrayal," he muttered. "People talk. Friendships change. It's not that deep." But the emptiness in his voice betrayed him. Even he knew the lie wasn't convincing. Ibis exhaled slowly, feeling the last remnants of anger drained from his body. He had expected this confrontation to bring satisfaction, maybe even closure, but now that it was over, all he felt was exhaustion. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just done. "You're right," he said finally, standing up. "It's not that deep. Because we're done here." He glanced at Ezekiel and Manny, and without another word, they followed suit, leaving Ebby sitting alone in the dimly lit cafe. As they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around them, washing away the tension that had clung to their skin. Ezekiel let out a low whistle. Well, that was anticlimactic. Ibis managed a small smile. That's the thing about people like him. They never really admit what they've done. They just keep moving until there's no one left to believe them. Mania nodded slowly. "So what now?" Ibis looked ahead, the weight on his shoulders finally beginning to lift. "Now?" He took a deep breath. "Now, we move on." They walked away, their footsteps steady and sure, leaving Ebby behind in the past where he belonged. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.